So Peter Drucker has been a sort of an ever-present sort of figure in my entire academic journey as I tried to get to grips with strategy and management. You know, in some ways, you could argue that Peter Drucker wrote the original book on management. You know, I can go back to the concept of the corporation, which was essentially a case study of General Motors and its management model, which then, of course, became the model for many, many other big companies around the world. I also go back to his book simply entitled Management for a definition of what management is and why it matters. And as I started to get into writing my own book, which is called Reinventing Management, I found myself, you know, drawn back to Peter Drucker's work many, many times. Because essentially, if you think about the last 40 years or so, what has happened, of course, is the whole leadership movement has become incredibly popular. And many of the biggest names out there of the last few years have been leadership gurus. And for me, nothing wrong with leadership, but in some ways, leadership takes us away from the essence of what makes companies tick. And arguably, you know, Peter Drucker and Henry Mintzberg, and maybe a couple of others, were the only people who had the sort of self-confidence, if you like, to continue to talk about management in the midst of this enormously populist movement around leadership. I believe we've actually reached a point where, you know, a lot of people are saying, you know, we've had enough leadership. We've had enough talk about leadership. Leadership is now, as a concept, become so diverse that we're not even sure what it means anymore. And that in some ways, we need to get back to the basics of understanding what the fundamental building blocks of making my company's work are. And for me, that is management. Management is getting work done through others. And the basic building blocks of management around coordinating activities and making decisions and motivating and developing people. You know, these are the things that Peter Drucker was talking about many, many decades ago. So for me, it's fundamentally, you know, what we should be talking about is the stuff that Peter was writing, you know, a few years ago. So clearly, we look at business today, we see a lot of turbulence, we see a lot of crises, you know, some very much kind of management-driven, some more externally imposed. We see a lot of questions as to whether our current model is working, is sufficiently robust. And I've got a number of pieces of data which suggest that the current model of management is not working as well as it might. You know, the overall level of employee engagement in companies, for example, is low. I mean, it's typically in the 20–30% level of employees are fully engaged in their work. Now, the challenge we face is there somehow something about management that is fundamentally wrong and needs to be reinvented, possibly drawing inspiration from some of the technological changes and social changes we see underway? Or is it the case that somehow management is a social set of things that have been around forever and will be around forever, that we've simply got to somehow adapt slightly on the margins to where we're going? My point of view is very straightforward. It is the following. On the one hand, we can identify a classic management model around bureaucracy and hierarchy, the stuff that Peter Drucker was talking about in General Motors in the 40s. On the other hand, we can identify what are often called an alternative set of principles. And a lot of the current books we see are in this area. It's about the wisdom of the crowds, the collective intelligence, rather than a hierarchical system of decision-making. It's about self-organization rather than bureaucracy. It's about focusing on intrinsic motivation as the driver of activity rather than a focus on extrinsic motivators, carrots and sticks. For me, it's completely nonsensical to argue that the future of management is going to be dramatically different to what we've had in the past, because, you know, we are, as human beings, not changing significantly than our forebears. But what I think is sensible is to say that whilst we can identify the alternative, the old principles on the left, the new principles on the right, what we can do is to say that management in the future has to draw from both dimensions, has to become essentially a clever combination of an old set of principles. We need some level of hierarchy in companies, whilst also tapping into the opportunities afforded by the internet and afforded by social change. that allow us to get, if you like, the best of the new whilst linking it to the best of the old. And indeed, the smart companies are the ones who will consciously choose the combination of these two models that best suits their particular set of challenges and best gives them some sort of competitive advantage, if you see what I mean. So you take decision making. Yes, we need some level of hierarchy, but we also need to find better ways of making use of the internet, making use of the collective expertise of the people who work for us, and aggregating that expertise together in a way that helps our executives make better decisions. That's the essence of where management is going. So I use the word reinventing management in my book. Probably rethinking management is a better term because in some sense, all I'm arguing for is incremental improvements in how we work that make use of the changes we see in technological sophistication brought about largely by the internet. And that is where the future of management, I think, takes us. For me, Peter Drucker, is a very important example for all of today's sort of generation of gurus, because most of them want to jump on the idea that there's one big thing that is going to change us in a dramatic way. We are on the cusp of a revolution in some sense. And of course, that's just nonsense. I just don't buy it. What is almost always the case is that revolution, with a small r, ends up providing, some substance, some opportunity, some sort of technology that enables us to kind of gradually evolve our existing approach. And Peter Drucker, over the decades and he was writing, of course, saw all sorts of changes kind of come into play in the workplace, but he never lost track of the timeless pieces of what was happening. And this is why, reading his old books is so fascinating, because, of course, the examples, of course, are kind of out of date and meaningless, but the basic principles are still as valid today as they were then. And in fact, in some ways, you could kind of put new examples in, leave his basic arguments intact, and you'd have a perfectly sort of legitimate article to be published in 2010. So I think that's exactly right. Continuity and change. As an executive, your job is to understand, what is timeless and what is temporary, and somewhere bringing those two together is the right answer. And it's a very, of course, specific answer to your situation and your industry.